Morning, everyone. This is Russell Rucker. I'm here for another constitutional talk. Now, today I wanted to show you a little speech on the road. I do talks to groups to explain the Constitution, explain the historical aspect of it, and how we got there, this kind of thing. And this is what I did this week up in Oconomowoc for a group, Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. So I just thought you'd be interested in seeing it. It begins with the French and Indian War, and it goes all the way through the Continental Congress and some of our Constitution itself, frankly, till I ran out of time. But I want you to know how we're doing certain things here. It's not just about my books, although I do want you to go out and get a copy of my latest book, 126 Days in Phil, that really does help you understand the arguments and what they were trying to accomplish. So I will talk to you on the other side. We'll let the speech from Wednesday play, and then I'll talk to you briefly in a few minutes. Thank you. Constitution. Okay, I mean that's become obvious writing several books on it. So I mean it's important to me, and I think it's important for everybody to understand what the Constitution is and understand that this is not a democracy, it's a republic. Now, when you're talking about the referendum question the gentleman was just talking about, that's direct democracy. Okay, and that's not what we have. Okay, if we were to have a direct democracy, every bill that came forward, we would be going down and voting on it. But we have a republic. And in a republic, we elect other people to make decisions for us. That's why you have a Senate. That's why you have a House. That's the whole purpose of it. But before we get into the actual bolts of the Constitution itself, I'd like to go back to a little history to make you understand how we got to the Constitution to begin with. You know, there was this 7-year war that was fought. It was basically a world war. You know, France, Spain, Holland was involved, England, and over in America here, it was the French and Indian War. So you had the French with some Indians, and you had some English with the Indians, basically fighting over territory. Okay, at the end of that war, England had pretty much won most of the territory over here. There were a couple enclaves left. One was down by Cuba, and I think the other was actually in South America. So they still had a little bit of influence here. But they were also left with a great debt. And that's where everything comes into play, because they were trying to get the colonies to pay for this debt. Okay, so they started with like the molasses tax and the sugar tax, and then they tried to do the Stamp Act. Now, the reason the Stamp Act was so violently opposed was because you could smuggle in sugar and you could smuggle in molasses, but you couldn't smuggle in a government stamped record. Okay, so there were so many things that had to be paid for tax. It was just absolutely ridiculous, the amount of taxes. I do put a video out every Monday on a number of different things, and you can find my constitutional talks on YouTube and Rumble. And I did cover this there, and there's lots of different things there if you wanted to actually take a look at what I've tried to find. Okay, so basically a Stamp Act was repealed, thanks mostly to Ben Franklin over there arguing in front of Parliament. Okay, he was over there for a time. He went over there to try to settle the Penn estates. The Penn family owned like 2/3 of Pennsylvania at the time, and they were given it for deeds he had done in war. But you know, they had come in and they were settling. So they had settled whole towns and stuff that were built on the land that the Penn family owned. So they had to go, so they were sent him to try to fix and try to get this all corrected, sorted out. And that's what he was doing over there. But he wound up getting involved in this Stamp Act feud. And he spoke for like, I can't remember, it's 30 or 40 minutes. And he managed to get it repealed. The problem he had was in America, they considered him a European, and in Europe, they considered him an American. So he was kind of a mess of sorts. Well, once the Stamp Act was repealed, then they tried the Intolerable Acts, which are a whole series of acts under that. Still try, because you got to realize they had a heavy debt from fighting this war, and their idea was, well, you know, we defended you all. You should pay and help pay for the defense of your colonies. But the colonists just didn't see it that way. You know, they thought it was too much. They didn't have representation in Parliament. Parliament was passing these laws, and so this is where you get, and this is where I got the wrong guy. It's not Thomas Paine, maybe it is. It was one of them was writing the letter. No, it was Dickinson. He was writing the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in the papers, and he was trying to fight. He was trying to overturn these Intolerable Acts. But you know, as time went on, we decided the safety committees, which was basically, you know, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and a group of people like that, trying to create, you know, problems and trying to get a struggle going to get independence. So you had that going on. They were trying to get these things repealed. And they formed the Continental Congress, these committees did. So they sent men in. So we're talking about 1774 now. We've moved ahead to roughly 20 years. And so they meet in Philadelphia, and they're trying to find a solution. They have several things they're trying to find. One is the rights of the colonists. Well, what are the rights of the colonists? And are we Englishmen or are we nothing? You know, is basically the argument here. And if we're Englishmen, then we have rights under English law. Okay, and so they're trying to sort this out, and they came up with a bunch of different things like the petition to the king. They were trying to get the king to understand their problems. There was the olive branch petition, which was their last ditch effort trying to get something accomplished. And in the end of that, it was like a 6-week meeting. And in the end of that meeting, they agreed to meet again the next spring. And they set a date in November that if they did not comply, they were going to cut off all trade. Okay, there wasn't going to be any trade with England anymore. We couldn't buy anything. They couldn't sell anything if they didn't repeal these acts. So that's kind of where we were at. So you get into 1775. They're back in Congress, and they're still trying to deal with this. By the spring of 76, Common Sense, Thomas Paine's book, comes out, and it galvanized the colonists against England, basically. If you read Common Sense, you almost got to read it a couple times. The first time I read it, it didn't do a lot, but it is written in Old English, and it's kind of tough, you know, to get through it and really understand it. But I mean, the second time I've read it, and it really kind of rings true. He's arguing over things like we have vast forests, we have different species of wood, we can build our own warships. Why are we relying on England? You know, and all these different things that we could do on our own. We're really paying England a lot of money, you know, through trade, and we could do this ourselves. So he basically is convinced the population of this. You know, when you talk about the Revolutionary War, that's not really the revolution. The revolution happened separate from the Revolutionary War. It happened in the minds of the men. They gradually became more and more convinced. If you go back to the 1740s and 1750s, it was common to brag about being the most loyal king's subject. Well, you get into the early 1770s, that was gone. So you have two completely different sets of feelings that are coming in conflict with each other. So by early 1776, there's starting to be more and more movements for independence. You had Common Sense come out. They're in Congress arguing over this, and they're kind of whispering about independence. But it's not long before the whispering becomes a lot louder. Okay, and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia made a motion for independence. That was on June 11th. And they agreed to do three things. There weren't a lot of people who were really for it, but in case it passed, they wanted it written. So they set up a committee to write it. It's known as the Committee of Five. They set up a committee to deal with trade and treaties, because if we were going to do this, we needed some kind of deal with the foreign countries. And the third thing was to confederate. Okay, to have a document or a confederation, which is what became our Articles of Confederation by the end of 77. They spent a year and a half arguing over what was going to be in the Articles of Confederation. And some of that language has survived into our own Constitution. One of the things that survived is the Second Amendment, where it says a well-regulated militia. But the Articles of Confederation says a well-regulated and disciplined militia with tents, ammunition, artillery. It spells out what each colony should have to defend themselves, as part of the Articles of Confederation. So that kind of ends the Continental Congress there, because then it becomes the Congress of the Confederation for the next few years until they're sent in to get an actual constitution. The other couple things that are important in the Articles of Confederation is it says that the states are sovereign. Okay, now that's pretty important. The other thing that's interesting about the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress, is they're voting by state. So when you go in, and even in the Constitutional Convention, when you go in, maybe you got 3 to 7 people representing your state. Well, every question has to be conferred with the others because you only have one vote. So you're voting by state, and where this is expressed today is the Senate with an equal vote. So these are important things right away that comes into play when we're talking about it. And that is our first Constitution. The Articles of Confederation is our first Constitution. The reason we don't have it today is because it's a weak document. They started fighting war for independence. They had to. I mean, by the time before the Declaration was passed, we'd had Lexington, we'd had Concord, we had Paul Revere running through warning everybody. At the end of that battle, we had surrounded Boston, and we had held them into Boston. But that wasn't going to last forever, at the end of mid-75, Washington was made commander-in-chief. And he was sent out there while it was surrounded, and he was made to be commander-in-chief of the army. But really, that army was all those militia groups that Paul Revere and Dow's and Prescott and knocking on doors and raising everybody up. They had sent a mass all the way around, and so all these militias had gathered. So that was really the army that he had to defend this new country with. They kept trying to raise more. They were recruiting out of Canada. We had a couple of generals up there trying to recruit. They kept bringing up, commissioning new generals and colonels and everything else from all over the colonies to try to get this up. So we have this Articles of Confederation. It's weak, and one of the big problems was the Congress could pass something. But maybe South Carolina couldn't afford to do what they'd passed. Okay? And you had the same problem in Virginia and Massachusetts. They were all trying, but there just wasn't enough funds. Robert Morris He went broke financing the revolution. He's known as the financier of the revolution. He went completely broke, and in the end, Congress passed laws on debt because they couldn't see him sitting in debtor's jail after all he had given for the Republic. So you get up to what is it? I think it's February 21st of 1787, and that motion from Congress comes forward to gather and have a constitutional convention. If you remember, we're now a country because we got a peace treaty in 1783, and that was difficult in itself. There were lots of movements against giving us as much as they did. One of our members went straight to England and said, hey, why don't we talk separately? And that's what happened, because before they weren't even going to give us the Mississippi River. They were only going to give us to the Alleghenies. They were going to cut off a section above the Ohio River as a buffer between us and the Canadian colonies. And, we really weren't getting a hell of a lot. So he went over there and got us a lot better deal than what we had. So we had our deal in 1783. We had our agreement for a country. But we still were confined by these Articles of Confederation. So in 1787, we gathered for this great convention. And this is the convention that really decides everything. Okay? Madison has sat up in his room. I've been up in that room that overlooks, you could see a half mile out in the distance. And he had this big library up there, and he's studying Rome. He's studying Greece. He's studying Magna Carta. He's studying every place that he could find where there was any kind of self-government. And he's working on a plan. And he's working on basically an outline of a plan. So he brings this, he talks with Washington, confers with him, and he brings this plan to Philadelphia. And Washington's elected as president, but he's not real active in it. He steps aside every day and allows Gorham, who is the chairman of the Committee of the Whole, meaning basically everybody, and he lets him run the meeting. I think maybe it's because Washington really didn't want to be that involved. He wanted to step aside. He was too big a man. Okay, and in fact, in the very beginning, there was argument over whether Washington would be president or whether Morris would be president. And Morris settled that by nominating Washington. And that's how he got it unopposed. So you have Madison coming in there with this plan. And the same day, Charles Coate Pinckney in South Carolina presents a plan. So you had those two plans. They agreed to lay them side by side and determine exactly which way to go. And that took up a whole day or two to try to sort out, just to read what they had and really all the discussions in that. Now the big difference here is the Congress sent an order to these men, to all these delegates. They weren't supposed to write a whole new constitution up. They were supposed to come and develop amendments to fix the Articles of Confederation. And here Madison had brought a whole new plan. So there were those that weren't very happy. They thought they had overrun their authority. But Madison's plan was good. And they started working off of Madison's plan. A few weeks later, Patterson of New Jersey, he just didn't like what was going on. And he submitted another plan he wrote up. So then you had three of them. At this point, Hamilton stood up and he said, I don't like any of these plans. And he said, I've been trying to be quiet because of my age. I'm real young here. He was the youngest guy in the room. And he really didn't feel that he should interject. But he held the floor for the day, and he started explaining what he really wanted out of a new constitution. Okay, so he gave an idea. A lot of people call that the Hamilton plan, but he never really submitted a full plan. It was just his ideas of what he wanted. So for about the first 2 months, there was this intense argument back and forth over just the legislative branch. Are we going to be represented as we are now with each state having a vote, or are we going to allow the people to have a vote? So are we going to be governed by representation like our House of Representatives is today, or more like the Senate? And that was really the big argument. At one point, those wanting a Senate didn't even want to pay the Senate. They wanted those most wealthiest men like the House of Lords. They wanted to pay all the members of the House, and they wanted all this money to come from the federal government because they did not want these new congressmen and senators to be loyal to their state. They wanted them to be loyal to the federal government, and they felt whoever was paying them would be loyal. Okay? They would be loyal to whoever was paying them. So this argument went on for some time, different versions of it, trying to figure out how to do it. And that's when that famous speech from Franklin comes up asking for prayer. Because he's trying to find a way to get past this divide they're in. He's trying to refocus them, get them idea. But a lot of people think that happened, that those prayers happened. And they didn't. Because at the end of the day, there were people making a move, well, how are we going to pay for a priest? Or a reverend? How are we going to pay for this? We don't have any money at all. And there were issues like that. So they adjourned without even settling it, which was kind of a troubling problem. Somebody suggested that, well, it was just before the 4th of July. We're going to have this big celebration, and maybe we should have prayers for the convention at this speech. And they set up a committee then. They set up a committee of 11 people, one from each state, to try to resolve it. And they came back with 2 branches, with a Senate being equal and the House being by population. And the compromise was the House would get the right to all spending bills, like it is today. Spending would have to start in the House. So that's the great compromise. But even that was really difficult to get through. They had a lot to argue about here. They still had the executive branch and numerous presidents. One guy wanted. Somebody wanted the picnic plan calls for the House choosing all the cabinet members of the executive branch. I mean, there's just some really interesting things that they tried to come up with, and they were bringing up all these different colonies and how we were governing over here and how they were governing over there and all these differences, and they were trying to bring everything together and really build something out of it. And this is one of, they didn't want power, anybody to have too much power. They tried to divide it up. That's why you have the division of power, because they thought that man had an inherent flaw. And that flaw was you always want more power. It's never enough. You get drunk on power. So they wanted to split it and divide it. And that's why you have a bicameral legislature, 2 bodies, that make up the legislature, elected in 2 completely different ways. Okay, then that's the whole idea of the presidency and the electoral college. So that's completely different. Now, if you look at Europe and a parliamentary system, you have them elect a legislature, and whoever wins that legislature is appointing their prime minister. That's a parliamentary system, and we have something completely different because you're electing them separately. So you can have, and we do many times, we have a legislature of one party, and you have a president of another party. And it's almost designed to fight amongst themselves. The other thing they did was they forbid anybody in the House or the Senate from taking another government job. They didn't like that idea. And they were worried that somebody would, they'll just appoint your uncle or your nephew or something. You'll find a way to get around it. And when they were talking about the spending, well, why can't I as a senator just go talk to my member over here from the House and I'll get him to propose that? All these different ways that somebody would go around it. But when you look at the Constitution, what the Constitution is a framework that's been filled in through laws, the government, and the state. But I think really the most important thing is that separation of power. It gives limited power to even the legislature all over the place. There's only certain departments that are actually constitutional. For instance, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, there's nothing in there about those. And there's lots of those. But we still have commerce, all these kind of things. Now, as far as taxation goes, I think the best thing I've ever seen about an explanation why we must have taxation, and that's in Washington's farewell address. And he says that to have government, you must have revenue. And to have revenue, you must have taxation. But there is no tax that would be pleasant or not a burden on the people. But we have to run the government. And if you look at there are two real important things in that farewell address from Washington. One is the taxation example, and the other is this warning about political parties. Hamilton and Jefferson were both in Washington's branch. They just about tore his administration apart. Infighting was horrible. And that may be one of the reasons he only wanted to serve for 2 terms. I don't think we'll ever really know, but there are those warnings in there, in the farewell address for that reason. So I really think it's important here. I touched on the legislative branch and the executive. And the other thing that we're really interested in, even some of the delegates writing home, they wanted a fair judiciary, an independent judiciary that was not attached to anything else. And if you look at it, you have a legislature, you have an executive, you have judiciary, and they're all separate. They're all independent of each other. And then there were moves to have law considered by the judiciary before it took effect. And these were things that were kind of shot down because, then you're colluding. Then you're colluding with that branch. And there were all these things they tried real hard. I think they did a really, really good job of this separation of powers. Now you get to the 4th article, and that's your full faith and credit. It gets into guaranteeing us a Republican form of government, not a Democrat-Republican form of government, a republic form of government. Okay, and the 5th is the way of amending. So they left this door open. I don't really believe the living, breathing theory. I believe you follow the text, what it says, and you look at a historical reason why whatever it was passed to come up to the conclusion of what it is. Just because we can amend and change things, I don't believe that gives it a living, breathing. That's just allowing us to change what happens. Living, breathing, they're usually looking at what if they lived today, what would they have done? Well, how can you possibly know that? So I think you have to go by what it says specifically and what the intention was at the time of the passage. And what were they arguing about? So you get to the 13th through 15th, your Reconstructionist amendments, you're in the 1860s. You aren't always back in the 1700s. Women's right to vote's in the 1920s, 18-year-olds is in the 70s. You've got this whole span of time where you have all these amendments that have changed things. Okay. The 6th Amendment has to do with the continuation of government, or the 6th article has to do with the continuation of government. So if you had a debt, you have a debt owed while the Articles of Confederation are in effect, you still have that debt. You're continuing everything the way it was, even though we're creating a whole new Constitution. So everything that was there still continues and carries over in that respect. Now, the seventh has to do with the ratifying of the convention. Okay, so you have these ratified conventions. So that's probably, in our state of mind, that's probably not that important anymore. The fifth, and the ways of amending it, which I just touched on, and you have those two examples. You have the amendments in 2/3 and 3/4 of the states, or you can call for a new convention, basically. My concern is, I've never been for that, but that's just me, because I'm concerned that they could come in with a whole new document again like they did the first time. And so I worry about the danger of doing that, okay? But I know there's a big movement for that. I mean, we don't have to get into the weeds. We don't have to agree on everything. Let's take a quick look at some of our amendments.
Yep. 5 minutes or so?
Fine. I'll be quick.
Yep.
So the First Amendment, we got the freedom of press. You've got freedom of religion, speech. You have your Bill of Rights there. Those were all created in the first Congress. A promise of Madison. He was campaigning against Monroe, and he wanted the states wanted a Bill of Rights with the Constitution. They were upset that they didn't get one. If you look at the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers together, you'll learn that the Anti-Federalists were really, more than anything else, they were fighting for a Bill of Rights. So you get through past the Bill of Rights. I'll try to speed up a little bit. The 11th has to do with a Supreme Court case that went bad, and so they passed the 11th Amendment to kind of get around it. The 12th has to do with the Electoral College, because they found a problem with it. And that problem was, if you have the most vote getters as president and the next as vice president, imagine that. You'd have Trump and Clinton at one point in the same cabinet. So this was kind of a problem, and this is what happened with Adams and Jefferson. Okay, and so then I mentioned the Reconstructionists, 13th through 15th. Then there's this big move in the 16th to try to get rid of that now, because they don't like this income tax. But you have to have some kind of tax. And it's discussed in a couple of different places. The other thing I want to mention is this, when you get to the preamble here, and you're talking about the promoting of general welfare. Now, I did a search of the Federalist Papers to see if there was anything. It's only two places it's mentioned. One is in the taxation clause, the other is in the preamble, and then it's mentioned in one of the Federalist Papers. And it talks about it as in defense. So I looked through some other records, and that's really what they were talking about with the general welfare clause. They were comparing it to all the border of New York and needing it to be protected, and general welfare was the good of the one is the good for the whole. I guess I'm going to stop there. If you got any questions, I'll be glad to answer them on anything.
So if Madison's plan kind of kick-started the process, what, as part of his plan, survived into the final Constitution?
Almost everything.
Really?
Yeah. His plan, you had a few changes here and there, but his plan really was what came out of it.
They could have saved a lot of time and just
yeah.
his plan.
My founder's book actually has all the plans written in it, so you could actually look at it. And I've tried to put that in the original Declaration of Independence, which was changed. There were some articles on slavery in there that were eliminated out of it because they didn't think some of the southern states would go along with it. So there's some interesting things there. And when Madison proposed the Bill of Rights, it was interjected in all of it. It wasn't Amendment 1, 2, and 3. It was to be put inside the original document. So it's kind of interesting. I actually typed it up one time the way he wanted it so that I could actually look at it. Because it's hard to look at it with just those changes and understand exactly what he was doing. But if you actually change the language in the Constitution and put in his sections, it's interesting. And the other thing I really find interesting is what they chose to capitalize in the original document. if you look at the words they chose to capitalize or to bring emphasis, that's really an interesting thing. Anybody else?
Well, thank you so much for sharing some of the initial parts of how we got to where the country started.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me where we are right now in the country. We have a portion of the country that just wants to erase, literally, our history. From the statues to the actual Constitution and everything in between. And to not take the time to understand how we got to where we are, that makes that easier. Understanding how we got to where we are creates a vestiture in that history. And that is part of the reason we're doing this. So most people don't have time to attend a class, let alone the countless hours that you have spent doing your research, doing your writing. So I appreciate that a ton, and providing your expertise.
Well, I'm real thankful you're studying it. And I do have a couple constitutional groups on Facebook if anybody wants to look me up, and I mean, I try everything I can. I drop that video every Monday so that people can actually look on some part, and some of it I find some pretty strange things sometimes. So
it's, again, everybody here talks to a lot of people on a regular basis. The Constitution and our form of government isn't supposed to consolidate power to any one group or individual. Can you get a lot of stuff done if that were to occur? Sure. That's called what?
Dictatorship.
Tyranny.
Yeah, that too, yep.
What we're trying to avoid at all costs. It depends on what side of the ideology you're on to whether it's good or bad. It's bad, period, because you're never going to have that continuation of the individual that is all good, all knowing, or whatever, that would have that tyrannical power. So hopefully, and what I think I've enjoyed over the last 3 years is the conversation that has occurred not only within the group, but outside of the group, when you get into talking to others and providing you with information about some of the history to spur some of those conversations, because the conversations nowadays tend to be combative, not interactive, not educational. And when you have this kind of information available to you, that conversation occurs as opposed to arguing. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. I'm back. How'd you like the video? I hope you thought it was worth watching. And I hope you consider me if you're in some organization and you'd like to get a speaker. I'd be happy to come out and talk. I don't charge for this service. I make up my my money on book sales. And it's not just 126 days, but our founders and textualism, both I have available. And textualism goes through the Constitution, and our founders has a more historical tone on how things happen. I hope you better understand it. And constitutional study is important, no matter whether you're using Hillsdale or Prego University or some other source, or just have some other guy that's helping to explain it better. And I commend anyone who's trying to study this. It's important to understand and know what we're talking about, so that when people tell you that something's not constitutional, you should have an idea of whether it is or not. And next week, we'll be back in our regular format, talking about certain aspects. But I just thought this was pretty good, and you should have a chance to see it. I know 40 minutes is a long time, but we'll catch you next time on Next Constitutional Talks. You folks have a good day now. Have a good week. Bye for now.